Welcome you all to the Biennial City of Science. Today we are going to have a major figure in the discussion of bioethics and transhumanism. Julian Savulescu is a philosopher. He is professor at the University of Oxford. He is the chair of UHERO Center for Practical Ethics. He was born in Australia, where he's now, and he will be talking to us from there. Julian Savulescu, the philosopher, has done research on ethics of various new and emerging technologies, including new methods of reproduction and enhancement of physical and cognitive performance through drugs or genetic manipulation. He is former editor and now board member of the Journal of Medical Ethics, and he will be talking about transhumanism. We've agreed that he will start putting some points across, some remarks, and then I will be putting some questions if he's so kind to answer them. Professor Julian Savulescu, welcome to Barcelona.
Thank you very much, Monica, and it's a great privilege to be here virtually. It looks lovely weather in Barcelona. Spain is
too good.
Spain is my favourite European country, and I actually got engaged to my lovely wife in Barcelona. So
wow.
I wish I could be there. So the picture behind me is Oxford, but I'm actually in Melbourne, where it's cold. We're in lockdown, and it's night time. So just before I begin, let me make a confession. I'm not a transhumanist, nor am I an expert on transhumanism, but I have given many arguments which converge with transhumanism, and I am sympathetic to many of their arguments. So I'll give you my understanding of what transhumanism is. It's essentially a movement which aims to improve the human being, not just to prevent or treat diseases, but to enable humans to live much longer, to have better mood, greater cognitive capacities, greater physical capacities, and greater sensory capacities. So it's about using science, medicine, and technology generally to improve the human condition, even beyond what is normal for a human being. So to give you one example of a transhumanist experiment that some of you may have heard of, in 2018, the Chinese biophysicist He Jiankui gene edited 2 embryos, which gave rise to the birth of Lulu and Nana. These babies were gene edited to be resistant to HIV. So this is not something that would normally would have had the opportunity of being immune, and this was creating a transhuman essentially, and this I think was really just proof in principle for the Chinese biophysicists that you could do gene editing on human beings. So the Chinese have also a massive research program on the genetics of intelligence. So roughly 50% of our intelligence is genetic. And with gene editing, we could add 70 IQ points to normal people. And so the Chinese have been sequencing the genomes of many gifted individuals, and they have the highest research capacity in the world for this. And I think that this program of gene editing is also aimed at gene editing to enhance intelligence, which would be another goal of transhumanism. So what sorts of technologies are we talking about? Obviously, gene editing is one which has been used, but what a technology which we could use now is genetic selection. That is testing embryos for their DNA and selecting the best embryo from 10 or 20 embryos that a couple produces during in vitro fertilization. So again, this is occurring. You can select embryos that will be healthier, But now there are what are called polygenic scores. These are scores that predict diseases, but also the genetic contribution to intelligence or any of the traits, for example, antisocial personality or empathy or impulse control that have a genetic contribution. And so one company, Genomic Prediction, is already offering this test of polygenic scores to identify embryos which don't have a disease, but which are at the low end of normal. This is another example of transhumanism. Making people better than well was a phrase Carl Elliott used. So genetics has huge potential for redesigning human beings to be better than they would be naturally. But in addition, there are other technologies such as brain-computer interfaces that could enhance human capacities. So Kevin Warwick is famous for implanting electrodes in his arm and connecting it to the internet and being able to move a robot at a remote distance through this technology. So in addition, there will also be connection to computers, or ultimately some transhumanists aim for human consciousness to be uploaded into a computer. Nanotechnology is another way in which humans could be radically enhanced. But for the foreseeable future, the biggest changes are going to come through biological modifications. Now, genetics is obviously one of the most powerful tools, but ordinary drugs or pharmaceuticals can also enhance human capacities. You're about to watch the Olympics and the Tour de France. Roughly 1 out of 3 medal winners in the Olympics, at least one, will be doping. And doping is a form of performance enhancement, of physical enhancement. It works, it's safe, and it enables people to go faster. So Ben Johnson, the famous 100-meter runner, first caught in the Seoul Olympics for doping with testosterone, said, if you want a human being to run under 10 seconds, they have to take testosterone to recover from the injuries and continue to train to achieve that speed. And out of all the people who have ever run, I think 10 people have ever run under 9.8 seconds, only one of them has not been implicated in doping, and that's Usain Bolt. So doping is an extremely common example of enhancement of physical capacities. Enhancement of mental capacities can be achieved through drugs like modafinil, which enhances concentration and working memory. So this is a cognitive enhancer. The film Limitless was based on this drug. Many American students and British students take this drug to enable them to study harder. Ritalin is another cognitive enhancer that also enhances impulse control and the ability to learn, the ability to restrain your impulses and violent impulses. So it both enhances cognitive ability and also enhances moral capacity in terms of reducing spontaneous violence. So these are examples of drugs that enhance cognitive ability. Mood, you'll all be familiar with drugs like ethanol, which is a mood enhancer. So one of the commonest psychoactive substances in the world is an enhancer. But people also take drugs like antidepressants such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like citalopram or Prozac to make them feel better. And of course, the holy grail for an enhancement is not just cognitive, mood, or physical capacities, but how long we live itself. Radical life extension is another goal of transhumanists. In fact, some transhumanists are aiming at immortality. So Aubrey de Grey, a professor of longevity, has long been advocating that if we applied enough scientific effort, we could get human beings to live for 1,200 years, because that's the rate a 10-year-old child is aging at. So if we could turn off the aging processes that start after the age of about 10, we could potentially live for 1,200 years. Now, this sounds like science fiction, but actually it's not. In non-human animals, the Methuselah mouse lives twice as long as a normal mouse, and that's done through genetic engineering to alter the production of growth hormone. So in the realm of non-human animals, there are mice that live twice as long. There are mice that can run 5 kilometers on a treadmill at 20 meters per minute rather than a few hundred meters. There are mice that are resistant to obesity. There are mice that have colour vision when other mice lack that. There are mice with better memory. So all of this shows the capacity for changing biology, and at a biological level, we are not much different to mice. And if you want to see the capacity for genetics to change the way an animal is, you only have to walk down the park and look at the different breeds of dogs. The 300 different breeds of dogs that exist today all come from a small group of wolves over several thousand years of selective breeding. So there are large, vicious dogs like the Doberman and small, placid dogs. There's the Chihuahua, there's the Great Dane, there's the Alsatian. Some are smart, some are stupid, some are hardworking, some are lazy, some are strong, some are weak. All of that is genetic. And with genetic selection, using in vitro fertilization and genetic testing, the same thing could be done with human beings. So what are the goals of transhumanism? I think that there should be 3 goals. One is well-being, enabling people to live better lives. The second is enhancing their autonomy, that is their capacity to create a stable identity and have values and realize those values for themselves. And lastly, enhancing moral capacities. And my own contribution to this debate has been to argue not just for enhancement of physical or psychological capacities, but enhancement of moral capacities. So enhancement is something that humans have sought all through human history. I had a phrase in one of my papers: to be human is to be better. So we are on the brink of a revolution where science and technology will enable humans not just to be healthier and not just to live for 85 years, but in the next generation, perhaps to live to 200 years and to have capacities much greater than you or I. So I think I'll finish there and let Monica ask some questions or
Yeah, for sure, because I have many. I have many questions. You've mentioned now three factors. Well-being. Who defines what is well-being? Who will define what is well-being? The individuals, societies, states, transnational organizations, because we all agree that we have a wonderful Declaration of Universal Rights, and all the countries have subscribed it, and all the countries are violating these rights every day, everywhere. So who will decide where the genetic engineering should intervene to guarantee well-being?
Well, I think that's the most important question we face as a species today. What is a good life for us? When is our life going better and when is it going worse? So we've been able to tackle health in a narrow sense, but I think now comes the deep question, how well are our lives or our children's lives going? So this is a philosophical question that has gone back to the time humans first thought about themselves. And in philosophical terms, there are 3 major ways of thinking about this. One approach is hedonism, which is happiness. So people's lives are going well when they're happy, when they're feeling positive, when they experience pleasure. So Bhutan has decided to replace the small country near Tibet, has decided to replace the GDP, or the gross domestic product, with the gross happiness index. And they measure the success of their policies according to how happy people are. A second major theory is that, as you said, happiness is in, well-being is in the eye of the beholder. That what we want is what's good for us, and getting more of what we want is better. And so economics is essentially a theory which says that the only thing that is of value is preference satisfaction. So that is a major approach. I think it's wrong, because preferences can be engineered. Preferences don't always track what is good for us. And often we ask, what should we want, rather than what do we want? And the third theory is more objective. Aristotle was a famous exponent of this theory, that we are human animals and certain things are good for us in virtue of our nature. So, for example, human relationships, having deep and rich personal relationships as Southern European countries, is a good thing. And that's what you should aim at, and that will bring happiness. Humans are creative. They seek knowledge. They have talents that are good when they're developed. So when somebody has a musical talent, there is something good about developing that talent. So there are these three major strands of philosophical thought that all of the great philosophers fit into, one of. And one possibility is to say, look, if we're going to aim for something, we should aim for the intersection of all of these three things. Things that will be objectively good for the human animal, that bring happiness, and that they want to achieve. Now, you might say that why should we leave it to philosophers to decide? And I have some sympathy with that concern. But ultimately, this is a question that we have to answer, and taking a vote, a democratic vote, is not going to give us the answer. This is an area which we need systematic study, philosophical study, to give an answer. Because if we're going to bring up our children or decide whether the internet is good or bad for our children, we have to decide what's the benchmark that we're going to measure that against. Because if you ask them what they want to be on the internet. But is it good for them? So I think we have a great crisis of well-being today that we have to address. Whether or not we engage in enhancement, we have to decide whether the technology, the extremely powerful technology that we're employing, that is changing our lives radically, is good or bad. And that requires an account of well-being. So I think in the beginning, we can aim. So if you look at intelligence as an example, many people are skeptical that intelligence promotes well-being, and this is a huge debate, which we could take 2 hours to discuss. But what is pretty clear is that the normal range of intelligence in terms of IQ is 70 to 130. If you're around 70 to 85, you're normal, but you can't fill in a tax return in the US. It will be very difficult to have jobs in a technologically advanced society. You're much more likely to be killed or die of a disease. So even that low, what's called now low normal intelligence, might be something we'll use enhancement for, rather than trying to create super geniuses. So I think we can start modestly with low-hanging fruit, where it's pretty clear that by anyone's plausible account of well-being, we're going to be promoting well-being. But I agree, this is a very deep and difficult question.
I've listened to some of your conferences, and in one of them you were saying we are 50 years behind in moral revolution to face the technology that we have already available. And we should do it before we take decisions about how to apply genetic engineer, for instance. This revolution, moral revolution, leads you to talk about moral obligation of parents, for instance, to not to go ahead with embryos that will have not a good prognostic, for instance, or they will not have a good life. In which terms you put this? Only talking about diseases, talking about their intelligence, where are the limits?
So the limits depend on the case. So, for example, I'm in favour of making people immune to HIV. If we had a safe vaccination for HIV, like a vaccine that was better than the COVID vaccines, if we had a vaccine which was like tetanus, that is completely safe for HIV, we should give it. And in fact, we should make it mandatory. But the experiment that the Chinese biophysicists did exposed two normal healthy embryos to quite extreme risks. That's why I described that experiment as monstrous, not because it's monstrous to gene edit, not because it's monstrous to make somebody immune to HIV, but it's monstrous to expose somebody without their consent to a significant risk of cancer or maldevelopment. So it will depend on the actual safety of the interventions and how confident we are that they are actually going to promote well-being or more moral capacities without compromise to well-being. Now, the problem with genetics, and I mentioned these polygenic scores, is that most things that we have are contributed to by many, many genes. And those genes have multiple effects. So they don't just make your IQ, tend to make your IQ higher. They also make you more disposed to autism and autism spectrum disorders. Or there's a paper about to come out, which I've written a commentary. The researchers have found a disposition to homosexuality, a genetic disposition, but it's polygenic. And it's not just homosexuality, it's what's called same-sex behavior. And what they find is that people who have these genes which tend to dispose to homosexuality also dispose to having more female partners in men who are straight. And they are also associated with openness to experience and also risk-taking. So there is a package. And so it's going to be very complicated to decide, is it good or bad to select these genes or change these genes? And so I think it's going to depend on the particular case and what the package is and the level of advance of the science and the level of advance of our concepts of morality or well-being. But there will be some low-hanging fruit. So, for example, psychopathy is highly genetic, particularly in children. In children, it's called callous unemotional personality. And these are children who burn cats alive and torture animals and may kill other children at a very young age. And about 80% of that is genetic. Now, maybe you can find a way of modifying that trait, because extreme psychopathy, although it might have been beneficial for human tribes, 100,000 years ago, when fighting with another tribe, to have a psychopath in their tribe, having a psychopath when you have weapons of mass destruction and the ability to make smallpox or coronavirus in a backyard laboratory is not something that we want.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe just looking at the cases where, it's fairly clear that there is an extreme deviation. And what tends to happen is medicine tends to say, oh, these people have a disease. So in the case of impulse control, they say, oh, you have attention deficit disorder, or you have antisocial personality disorder. So when diseases are invented, in order to enhance human beings.
Yeah.
And I think this is mischievous.
But when you say, you've put a point across that is very interesting, because the persons who would have tendency to psychopaths, I think there's a 1% of the population, and you in one of your conference mentioned that 70 million people could develop psychopathic. So there's a moral mandate to say these embryos should not evolve. They should not be able to progress. But when you talk about homosexuality or LGBTI tendencies, then who would take the decision not to develop this embryo because he lives in Russia and knows that Russians are discriminating people with LGBTI? And that's the point. I mean, in Russia, they do have a prevention and discrimination to these people, and then parents there would say, I don't want my baby to be born with this characteristic because he will have not a good life.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Another one which we have now, which is even more common, but which is done, is sex selection. So in India, there are 6 men to 5 females in some parts, and despite the government trying to stop this. So sex selection already occurs in China and India. And why does it occur in India? It occurs because of the dowry system. If you have a girl, you have to pay sometimes 2 to 3 years of your salary as dowry for her. And secondly, because they have a religious belief that only the son can perform the funeral rites that enable reincarnation. So in my view, we should change those beliefs and practices. We should change the causes of the desire to select males or to select against homosexuals. I think banning the use of this kind of technology is attempting badly to treat the symptoms of the disease, and that's why it doesn't work. They've already tried to ban sex selection in India. It doesn't work because people don't want to be poor. And that's a very reasonable desire. So you need to try and change the dowry system or the religious beliefs that are leading to these practices. So I think ultimately who should decide? It shouldn't be the state. The state should set some limits. So I don't think people should be able to deliberately create a psychopath because they want their child to be a world famous boxer. I think that should just not be allowed. But I think people can be guided and given the opportunity to have children that are free of disease or who start life with more advantages. So even enhancement in the low normal range. But I think we should be very reluctant to force them because that's, of course, what the Nazis did do, is they forced people to be sterilized or even killed them to bring about a certain kind of society. So I think that we should place freedom first, generally, unless there's a very clear harm.
Yes, but there's a problem when you know that you live in a racist world like we have, or where xenophobia is every day very present in our reality, in our social reality, and you have the chance to choose that your baby child, your embryo, will not be black, then the opportunities that this person will have, if it's white in a racist world, would be part of the freedom of decision of these parents, wouldn't it? Even if it's not prohibited by the state.
Well, again, I think this is a very difficult case where it depends, on the circumstances. But even if you thought that this was wrong, you could say we will not allow selection or modification of traits which are purely socially constructed. So there is nothing inferior about having darker skin or being female. The disadvantage comes purely from the way society is constructed. Whereas intelligence is not purely socially constructed. It actually, and the same with being able to see or being able to hear or being able to remember. These are features about ourselves that have how bad a low level of function is partly dependent on how society is constructed. But even with perfect justice, there will still be a disadvantage in having certain low levels of function. So we could restrict enhancement to these what are called non-positional goods, that things that have a non-positional element. By that I mean that they are beneficial in themselves, regardless of whether other people have them and regardless of whether society is just.
Yeah, you were talking.
So I think that's one way to respond.
You were talking of the many genes that are involved in intelligence and in many others for sure. But when we talk about epigenetics, the factors of epigenetics, you can modify the DNA to modify our genes to get out of our body or our development a certain characteristic, and then the factors of epigenetic come into the path, and you will not avoid them to develop, would you?
Well, we live in an uncertain world where we can never control, or we won't be for the next several hundred years able to control everything. So even if you gave a child the best genetics in the world, they can have a car accident at the age of 1 or develop a disease. So this will always have an element of uncertainty. All you can do is try to maximize the chances that somebody will have a good life. You can't guarantee that they will. Of course, they will have free will as well, and they may choose to squander whatever gifts they have. So life is about reducing the chances of bad things and increasing the chances of good things. But nothing is really certain. And so the fact that we can't certainly create something through enhancement is no objection to it. It applies to everything in life. But that shouldn't stop us trying to enable people to have a better chance. And I think the point that I find most important in this debate is that unless you have a very religious view that man or woman is made in the image of God and has everything that is necessary to lead the best life, unless you have that view, then, and I have the view that we're all born unequal. Some people are born with terrible diseases and they live very short lives with a lot of pain. Some people live to 100 in very good health. Some people have incredible gifts and some people have incredible limitations. And that's what evolution produces. It doesn't produce people designed to be happy. It produces a whole range of different individuals, and some are very privileged and some are very underprivileged from the moment of conception. And if science gives us the chance to correct that inequality, I think we should use that science. I don't see any benefit to natural inequality. And I don't think that I'm made in the image of God. But if that is your view, then there's just really nothing to say. You think that things are good enough, and if you die at the age of 5, that's God's will, and there's nothing we should have to do about it.
And then should we assume that the path is that we go into less diversity, humankind less diverse, because we will correct all that make us less capable, and we can already be more efficient, more intelligent, so less diversity and less empathy socially?
Well, I mean, it again depends on precisely how you use this technology. So, I mean, to take a sort of the simplest example is how long we live. There is a lot of diversity in that. But it would be great if there was less diversity and it was at the other end. So there was some sorts of diversity, you know, have no moral importance. In fact, they're kind of morally bad. But yet some other kinds of diversity may be worth preserving and may be good. So the balance of introverts and extroverts in a society, it may be good that there are people with different kinds of characters, in which case, if it's good for society, then we have to balance that against the well-being of the individual and maybe, you know, restrict choices or encourage certain choices. So it will depend on the kind of diversity. Will it contract? I don't know. Presumably it will, but then it can expand. If you look at people now, they have radical body modification to be different. And many of the transhumanists have extreme body modification, and they call it morphological freedom. So it's possible diversity will increase. But I think that these are ethical questions that we have to decide on the values of morality, well-being, autonomy, and the balance between the individual and society. And balancing those range of values can help us decide what limits should there be and what should people be free to do and what must they do.
When you were talking about moral enhancement, you were talking about well-being and the thought of philosophers about what is well-being. I haven't been much presidents of the United States or Russia or China being philosophers. They normally don't get into politics, and a few philosophers determine the policies of these countries, which are leading the world. Just now, they are all made up to solve our problems. And I think that their criteria have more to do with economic development and economic interest than with well-being and moral enhancement of our society. This is the key point, no? Who will decide how to improve these technologies with the criteria of capitalism wouldn't end up being a moral, better society.
Well, I completely agree. I think there is a crisis today that the destiny of the planet and people is determined by democracy, global power, and capitalism. And I think that has to change. I don't think that democracy is the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama said. I think we need a more ethical kind of democracy and capitalism that's guided by values of well-being and moral values, such some level of equality. So how will that occur? I'm not a political scientist. Maybe the next generation, younger people, will be able to force this from the ground up. But it's hard to see a happy ending, really, when basically those are the forces that decide, you know, who gets the vaccine, what kinds of vaccines are developed, what sorts of policies are produced. So I completely agree. I'm pessimistic.
You distinguish, I am pessimistic as well, in that we agree fully, but that's precisely because that's why I think your arguments are really interesting today and to be discussing this. Would you apply the same criteria when we have to intervene genetically in an embryo and therefore in germ cells or in an adult with somatic cells? We will use the same criteria, or it's different?
Yeah, look, in adults, it's much easier because you can give them the information and let them decide for themselves whether they judge the risks are worth the benefits or whether they want to be, you know, altruistic and take part in a very risky experiment or intervention. So it's much easier when it comes to adults. It's much harder when that change has to be done at the embryo. And the reason why somatic gene therapy has failed is because you have to change billions of cells. It's extremely difficult to change billions of cells. With the embryo, you only have to change one cell once, and everything else will follow. So in many ways, gene editing of embryos is much more likely to work and to have profound effects. But of course, you can't ask an embryo for consent. And for this reason, many people like Jürgen Habermas or Michael Sandel have said you should never make changes on an embryo unless it's for a catastrophic disease or for a severe disease. And in that case, you know, if you didn't do it, the child would have a severe painful disease that they could blame you that you didn't cure their disease when they were still an embryo. And so even Sandel and Habermas and critics of enhancement accept gene editing for severe diseases. But I think the same arguments apply to enhancement, because it's not just whether we have a disease that affects how our lives go. In fact, most of the time, it's nothing to do with diseases. It's the kind of talents, abilities, character that we have. And just as education is made mandatory for children, which is a cognitive enhancement, it improves IQ, so too could enhancements that were safe and aimed at something like impulse control or intelligence or sense of fairness or uncontroversial moral or prudential goods could also be employed. Because if you didn't do that, then the child can also blame you and say, you know, I could have been able to go to university if you decide to gene edit me.
Yeah. Let's put an example I was thinking of. I've met some Asperger people who has an intellectual and competitive life. They have some social disadvantages, but do they have really productive intellectual lives? What would you do? Would you apply the same criteria that saying, you know, this is a defect of this embryo and we are not going to develop it?
So my postdoctoral supervisor, Derek Parfit, was, some people say, the world's most famous moral philosopher. So Derek Parfit. And he died a few years ago. He was an extremely brilliant man, but he had Asperger's syndrome. But he achieved so much in his thinking and his philosophy and his knowledge, but his marriage was very bad for his wife. And so his human relationships were less rich and fulfilled as his intellectual development, knowledge, and achievement. So in an objective scale, he had a mixture. He was high on one, low on another. He was very happy doing what he did, and that's what he wanted to do. So actually, his life was very good. And I think that's true for something like Asperger's generally, that they can have very good lives, even though in one area their life is more difficult. And the same for manic depression. This can be associated with creativity. So it's not clear whether manic depression plus being more creative is bad. So I think there'll be many grey cases like this where we can leave it to chance or allow parents to decide to select different embryos, but maybe not to intervene to change embryos.
Yeah.
So these grey cases shouldn't distract us from the fact that there will be black and white cases, cases like psychopathy, which is clearly not a good thing.
Yeah. That's. Let's do another step. Down syndrome, babe. He has a life that probably, in intellectual terms, obviously is having a lot of problems. he will have difficulties in health terms because he has more risk of heart diseases, Alzheimer, and so on and so forth. And probably he will not be autonomous, which is another factor that you have mentioned earlier. But maybe the people who is surrounding this person will improve their empathy, will cooperate, will be more aware of their disadvantages. We should, in these cases, in Down syndrome or any other that you want to choose, apply which criteria?
Well, the Down syndrome case is very emotive, and your argument works exactly for if you have a normal child who has a brain injury and ends up with the same characteristics as a child with Down syndrome, or you, if you have an accident in a car and have a brain injury and end up with, you know, an IQ of 50, not able to live independently, requiring other people to care for you. So in all of those cases, we think we should make the best life for that person possible. there's you know, that's what, you know, society should be aiming to, make everyone's life as good as it can. But you would want to be cured of that brain injury that left you with an IQ of 50 and unable to look after yourself and so on, if it was possible, because you think that your life would be better. It might not be happier in the end, but you would have more chance of realizing the goods in life. That's why we have treatments for brain conditions. So, you know, I think the same argument applies to children with Down syndrome. Yes, we should give them all the opportunities for the best life possible, but that doesn't mean that life is going as well as a life can go. Just as your life with a brain injury and now no longer able to work or to carry on with your family and relationships and live independently is going as well as it was before. So, you know, I know that sounds harsh, but those cases are exactly symmetrical.
One of your arguments is that genetic engineering can work towards a society less unequal and with more social justice. This technology will be available to everybody, or we will strengthen even more the inequalities that we have nowadays in this world, because we are already unequal.
Well, my bet is it will increase inequality, as every technology increases inequality. So, you know, I think what will happen is, yes, it will be available to the rich or to powerful countries such as China, and it won't be available to everyone. That's what I think will happen. Does that have to happen? No, it doesn't have to happen. It could be like healthcare. We could make a basic level available if it's important. If it's important to have enough intellectual ability to go to school or to go to university or whatever your benchmark is, then we should give it to everyone. Now, of course, we don't have universal healthcare around the world. So why would we have universal enhancement? So, you know, and we can't even get healthcare right. So I don't think we're going to get this right. But I think there should be a safety net for healthcare and for education and for important enhancements. I think they're all the same. So there's nothing special about enhancement or transhumanism. I think we can deal with it by and large with the same principles that apply to other goods in life, like healthcare or education.
You think we are prepared to apply it? You think we could already apply some of the new gen techniques, and we are not doing it just because we are too preventive or because the states don't want to assume this responsibility to parents to choose if their child will be girl, boy, tall, blonde, intelligent or not intelligent?
I think, you know, for example, sex selection has been available. Certain forms of genetic selection are available. I think there is a commitment to equality, and that often takes the form of what's called leveling down equality, so that if you can't raise everyone up, only some, then bring everyone down to the same level. And that's view of equality, I think, is what tends to influence policy, particularly in Europe. But I think partly it's that the technologies are still, they're just on the upstroke of the curve. So there aren't radical enhancements apart from the computer and the iPhone and external technology at the moment. But once those become available, and I think that will be in the next 10 or 20 years, then it will kick off. And people are always very righteous and signaling their commitment to grand ideals when there aren't benefits on offer. But once there are benefits, they vote with their feet. And that's what you've seen with the pandemic. People will run to get the toilet paper or to get, whatever benefit, they can perceive. So I think at the moment, the impact of technology, internal technology, is fairly modest. Kevin Warwick can move the arm of a robot somewhere, so what? Or people walk around with a magnet under their skin so they can detect magnetic fields, so what? But once it becomes possible to significantly change the human condition, something like 30% of students in the US are using modafinil, and that only has a small effect, but this will increase.
I was trying to imagine what would happen. Gattaca is the cinematographic reference that we have in our minds. But I was thinking, what if with the leaderships that we've known recently, I don't want to say names because, as you know, everything can be misinterpreted. One of these technologies, CRISPR, is allowed for the people to decide which sort of society we will have. Can we imagine this society in which half of the population is transhuman and half of the population, and probably the more poor countries, are not, because they don't have the information, because they don't have access to it, or they don't feel the need because they need to fulfill other needs more basic than that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the most likely scenario, that there will be different tiers around the world and even within countries, that the current inequality will continue to increase, because in the last 100 years, inequality has massively increased progressively, and it continues to increase. So yes, the most likely scenario is that there will be people living to 150 with healthy lives, with with the ability to have transcendental experiences, access to drugs to enhance their consciousness in many different ways, and there will be people dying at the age of 50 of very basic diseases. So that is a feature of the organisation of the world into nation states, and the current world order that we have. Is it necessary? No. We could remove poverty globally with a stroke of a pen. We could remove the need for organs with a stroke of a pen. Most of the problems that we face today could be solved with a stroke of a pen, but we choose not to write what's necessary. So I think we could make it so that and I think what you will see is the technology becoming cheaper and more accessible. So I think this period of radical inequality will be fairly short-lived, and then there will be what's called a trickle down. So with the mobile phone, we saw this. Initially, it was extremely expensive and only a small group of capitalists had it. And now it's revolutionized life in Africa and in many places, and commerce and business. And it's extremely cheap. Now, that doesn't mean that that's eradicated poverty, but it has brought people up. So I think what you will see is there will be big inequality, but then this kind of technology will go global and raise people, but the top group will probably continue to increase. So inequality will increase, but the level the worst level will improve. So, and I think that's still worth achieving, because those individuals will still have better lives than they would have otherwise have had, even though someone else in another country is having a much better life than them.
Yeah.
And so I think in this sense, equality is not the most important value.
As far as moral enhancement goes, working with these advantages, with these technological advantages, because we do have a planet. You've put this example sometimes about climate change, and we, the individuals, are incapable of thinking 2 generations ahead to take care of this planet, and because we are egoistical, because we face our own needs and don't think of needs of 2 generations to come. That's what I think the moral enhancement is so difficult, because we are governed by a society in which egoism is one of the main factors that lead our behavior, isn't it?
Well, yes, that's true, but we're also we're also altruistic, whereas we're a mixture of light and dark, as Shakespeare once said. So, I mean, most people are not purely egoistic, and they have the capacity for significant moral action. And I think it's a matter of doing everything we can, given the crisis that we face, to bring about moral improvement. Now, that will mean creating moral education, not just religious education. It will require agreeing on a set of values and principles and approaches that we teach children. And it may well require changing them biologically, if we can, to make education more effective. So most enhancements work through a combination of modifying the environment plus the direct biological intervention. So another kind of enhancement is what's called transcranial electrical stimulation. That is, stimulating parts of the brain associated with learning during particular tasks. So you can do this to improve language acquisition, or improving numeracy, or improving motor skills. And you could do it to improve empathy, or you could do it to improve cooperation. And so I think that this is one way in which enhancement may play out, that for children, we decide to aim at certain values more directly and explicitly, both moral and prudential for the child, and we help them to learn how to achieve those values. Now, that's not going to work across the world. That's not going to eliminate 70 million psychopaths. That's not going to cure our problems. Everyone today wants a silver bullet. They want COVID to go away. They want something simple. There's not going to be any simple solution to such complex problems. There's only going to be small things that we can do, which are part of a big tapestry.
Let me put a final question across, because people here is about to faint with the sun of this wonderful Saturday in Barcelona, and they are listening to you very carefully. I was thinking, like, what are you working now on? And you've changed your mind during the recent years, seeing how is this technique being applied, this CRISPR, or the program in China that you said is very progressive and very advanced. Have you changed your mind when you've seen how the states are applying the technology?
That's a good question. I mean, what I've been working on COVID, pandemic ethics, and the value of life. For example, everyone counts deaths, and every day we hear the death count, the death toll.
Yeah.
But if you die 5 minutes before you were going to die, it's not so bad. If you die 50 years before you could have died, that's really bad. And I think in the center of this debate has been a failure to consider basic ethical issues like what is the value of life? Is it a function of length and quality, or is just any death is equally bad? And I've argued that deaths can be more or less bad, and that our way of measuring these has been wrong. And the way of allocating our resources like ventilators or vaccines has been wrong. I've also been looking at when you can coerce people and use mandatory vaccination. And I did change my mind there. I started off thinking that vaccination would have to be mandatory, but over a year ago, I predicted there would be some side effects with the vaccines. And I said, if that's the case, we have to incentivize people, not coerce them, pay them money, which has been very unpopular. So I changed my mind about vaccination in the last year. But in terms of human enhancement, I think that in my book in 2012, Unfit for the Future, predicted that we may end our own existence this century through nuclear war, through climate change, through artificial intelligence, but also through biological weapons. And I think that the problem with COVID has made me realise that is more real than even I imagined 10 years ago. And what's made me kind of, I guess what I've changed my mind is that, you know, I think that the risks that we face are much greater than we realise. Now, I am skeptical how it will be implemented, but I think we have to change. You know, we're not able to continue going as we've been going, and something has to change. And part of that will be a social, cultural change, but I think part of it needs to use biology not just to treat and prevent disease, but to as I've said, to change ourselves, because we are the elephant in the room of our problems. You know, we talk about problems as if they're external. Even COVID is the result of our choices, either to experiment on coronaviruses in a biological weapons facility, or to engage in certain meat-eating practices and wet markets. So both of those we choose to do. So although this is something that arose and is a virus, we enable the conditions for that virus to emerge. And that is paradigmatically the problem we face this. But we don't look at that. We don't say, what we say, or we must develop a vaccine, or we must, you know, develop a treatment. And those are just symptomatic relief, because the problem is us and what we're trying to do. So we need to try to change what we're doing. And that's the hardest job.
I think that if the world would work properly, you would be a figure not only recognized in scientific and ethical fields, but everyone should have access to your arguments, discussing it in the big media, because I think the arguments that you are putting across should be discussed globally to make people aware of the advantages and problems of what we have been talking to. So we will try to catch you in 10 years' time to see how things are going. Professor Savulescu, if we've been able to enhance our humankind with moral criteria that make us a better society. Thank you very much for attending us.
My pleasure. I hope I'll be there next time in person and enjoy the sun with you. So, as I said,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Gràcies a tothom per passar la calor, eh? Déu-n'hi-do, no? Us heu anat a